Hey there, everybody. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another edition of our Artist Retrospective series. Today, we are going to take a look at the history of Britain's classic hard rock band, Deep Purple. So I've been talking about this one for a while. It's my favorite band of all time, so I figure let's kind of do this right today. We're going to go from the beginning all the way up to the current incarnation of the band. So we're going to start back in 1968. So you've got a bunch of guys playing in a bunch of different bands. Ritchie Blackmore, guitar player, who was with Screamin' Lowered Such, and the Outlaws, not the Southern rock band, the Outlaws, as well as Neil Christian, and he was a big studio musician. He and like Jimmy Page and those guys would constantly cross paths in the studio. John Lord, Hammond organ and keyboard player, who actually played with the Artwoods and the Flower Pot Men. That's who he was with at the time. Nick Simper on bass, also a member of the Flower Pot Men. Rod Evans and Ian Pace on drums, vocalist Rod Evans, were with a band called The Maze. And then you've got their original name. So when these guys finally got together and decided to form a band, the band was originally called Roundabout. At the time, they were playing kind of like R&B, early rock and roll, that sort of thing. Until 1968, the band gets signed to Tetragrammaton Records in the US and EMI in the UK. And they decide to change their name to Deep Purple. Good thing. Don't think the Roundabout would have kind of tested time there. And they release in May of 1968 an album called Shades of Deep Purple. Kind of humble beginnings, all right, kind of psychedelic, early rock, that heavy rock that we would know Deep Purple for, not quite hitting their stride. Some decent tunes on here. The most popular song, obviously, Hey Joe was one of them. So Hey Joe was a Joe South song that they covered. Jimi Hendrix also did it shortly thereafter, as well as Hush was a big hit for the band. And that got them a bit of attention. Let's see, Hush actually hit number 4 on the US charts. The album itself made it to number 24 on the Billboard charts and basically helped get them an opening slot on Cream's farewell tour. You know, Cream, the big supergroup trio, Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, Jack Bruce. They kind of couldn't make it happen for too long, and after like 2 years together, decided to do this big, long farewell tour. And of course, these guys got to open up for that tour. It was really, really their big break. So, you know, they do a bit of touring, back into the studio, released this album, The Book of Taliesin, October 1968 in the US. It actually would get delayed. The UK release would get delayed until early 1969. Kentucky Woman, a Neil Diamond number. The cover on here, that's their kind of like their big hit. Made it to number 38 in the Billboard charts. Pretty decent, okay? But the album itself was not as successful as the one before it was their debut. This one only made it to number 54 on the Billboard charts and not released, like I said, till early 69 in the UK. But things were kind of happening for the band. So, number 3, they recorded this one in March of 1969. It's self-titled, okay, just titled Deep Purple. And all sorts of problems with the label, so Tetragrammaton kind of folded and basically were kind of picked up by Warner Brothers. All their assets were picked up by Warner Brothers, so the band found themselves actually on Warner Brothers. Actually, pretty good deal for them at the time. So what else happened here? So right around this time, 3 of the founding members decided that they needed a change in the band. So Ritchie Blackmore, John Lord, and Ian Pace started talking to each other, and they kind of wanted to take the band in a different direction. First 3 albums, like I said, poppy, mixed psychedelia, that kind of Hammond guitar thing was just in its infancy. You know, obviously influenced by the Vanilla Fudge quite a bit, but they're still trying to find their way. And they wanted to go, and at least Blackmore wanted to go into a heavier rock direction. John Lord wanted to do some kind of orchestral sort of things, which we're going to get to in a minute. But they felt they needed a new singer. Okay, Rod Evans just wasn't cutting it. So what they did was they looked around a bit, and they were actually recommended a singer from a band called Episode 6 named Ian Gillan. Masterful pipes. Okay, he was the rock guy that they were looking for. Also with Episode 6 was bass player Roger Glover, so he kind of came along as a package deal. So basically, the band secretly brought in these two guys. They went into the studio, recorded a single called Hallelujah, before they even told Evans and Simper. Simper just kind of wound up getting the short end of the stick here. We might, arguably a better bass player than Glover, but as history works out, obviously it was the right choice. So finally, those two guys are given the pink slip, and they're sent off on their merry way, and Gillan and Glover are actually announced into the band. Okay, so this was actually now the Mark II. If you're a Deep Purple fan, you know there's each lineup changed. Mark I was the original lineup. Mark II, Gillan, Glover, Blackmore, Lord, Pace. Okay, so let's see. So then I mentioned a second ago that John Lord had these ideas about doing this kind of orchestral rock thing. Okay, and that actually wound up being recorded. Wrote this long piece made up of different movements to include rock musicians as well as a full orchestra. So in September 1969, the band went to the Royal Albert Hall with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra and recorded Concerto for Group and Orchestra. This was released on LP, as well as they made a film of it. Hopefully some of you have seen that. It's actually kind of cool, but don't think most of the band really enjoyed playing that too much, especially Blackmore. He kind of was like, all right, hopefully John's getting this out of his system. We need to move in a different direction. Lord also wrote another similar type piece called the Gemini Suite for the band, which they recorded, but I think that was kind of the end of it, because they went into the studio in late 69, early 1970, and recorded this beast called In Rock. My personal favorite Deep Purple album of all time, and probably one of the most important albums in the history of hard rock and what would later become known as heavy metal. Definitely one of the groundbreaking heavy albums of its time, alongside, Zeppelin's first two albums, Black Sabbath's first album, stuff from Cream and Hendrix, all those albums, first Uriah Heep album. But this was a marked difference in both energy, volume, and heaviness from the three albums that came before it. Gillan, screaming up a storm. Okay, Blackmore's guitar riffs, thunderous, heavy, just really kind of distorted, fuzz-laden Hammond organ. Crazy rhythms. I mean, a lot of great tunes on here. What do we got here? Bloodsucker, Child in Time, one of the best songs ever. Oh, what else? Flight of the Rat, Into the Fire, Living Wreck, Hard Loving Man. Then, of course, Black Knight, which was released as a single at the time, not included on the original album, but thankfully for CD reissues and remasters, we get Black Knight inserted into here. Oh, as well as Speed King. How can you forget Speed King? So, again, this was released in the summer of 1970, reached number 4 in the UK. Black Knight, the single, reached number 2. Martin Birch and Andy Knight, engineers for the album. Remember that name, Martin Birch. Obviously, most of you who follow hard rock and metal know well who he is, but he really got his start doing albums for Deep Purple. So he worked on almost all the 70s albums for Purple. So that album took off, obviously, and they released a fairly quick follow-up back into the studio after a bunch of touring heavy at this point, all over the States, all over Europe, and they're back into the studio in early 1971 and released Fireball, summer of 1971. So almost a year in between the release of the two albums, but the band was non-stop touring and then hitting the studio. Another engineer job by Martin Birch here. This particular album reached number 1 in the UK, the first number 1 in the UK. Strange Kind of Woman, it was the single at the time. That reached number 8 in the UK single charts. And it's funny because that tune and another tune called Demon's Eye were kind of flip-flop for both the US and the UK releases. But again, thankfully for these remastered editions, we have all of it on here now, which is really cool. Great album. Kind of a different album, a little more variety, I think. The title track, Fireball, No, 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 Demon's Eye, like I just mentioned, Anyone's Daughter, kind of like a folky Bob Dylan type of tune. The Mule, which is fantastic, drum extraordinaire piece for Ian Pace, as well as Fools, which I love, heavy tune. No One Came, another great tune. And then we got Strange Kind of Woman, like I mentioned, I'm Alone, Freedom, Slow Train, some kind of leftovers that were recorded at the sessions that get thrown in on these, wonderful reissues that are put out. So, a really good album. Again, just really moved the stock of Deep Purple even farther. But their kind of greatest album in the eyes of many was soon to be next. So, in December of 1971, so as you can see, a lot happening here. Right around the same time. These guys are not taking much of a break at all. So December 1970, they go to Montreux, Switzerland to record what would become Machine Head at the casino with the Mobile Stones mobile recording truck. And what happens is, this is Machine Head, by the way, what happens is, and you all know the story, Frank Zappa and the Mothers are playing a concert at the casino, and some idiot lights up a flare gun in the middle of the show, winds up catching fire. The whole place is up in flames, so they got to get everybody out of there, and it's a big disaster. And obviously Purple can't finish recording their album there, so they have to move over to the Grand Hotel, where at the time they decided to write a song based on that whole event happening, the fire, the destruction, and all that kind of stuff. And of course that song will go down in history. It was one of the greatest guitar riff songs of all time, Smoke on the Water. The lyrics of the song are all about that whole fire and everything that happened there. But a very, very strong album. Like I said, for most people, this is considered Purple's favorite album, or Purple's best album, I should say. All depends on what you like. Highway Star, this has all their real classics, okay? Most of their radio hits and staples. Highway Star, Maybe I'm a Leo, Pictures of Home, Never Before, Smoke on the Water, Lazy, Space Truckin', and of course, When a Blind Man Cries, which was actually recorded during the Machine Head sessions, but not included on the original album. It was actually released as a single, as a B-side to the single for Never Before. But now, of course, with the remasters, you get it on the album as well. It's kind of nice. So, what other kind of information? So, let's see. So, the album hit #1 in the UK. Okay, second number one UK hit in a row. #7 on the US charts. So, really, the band is really starting to peak here as well. #1 in Canada. Martin Birch, of course, co-engineer on the album. Smoke on the Water is a single, hit #4 on the US singles charts. All right, and so this prompts them to go do more touring all over the world. So in 1972 especially, they go on this huge tour of North America that eventually takes them over to Japan. And in Japan, they decide to record a handful of shows throughout Tokyo and Osaka, Japan, that they then decide they're going to release as a Japan-only live album. They were going to release it only in Japan, but the recordings were so good, and the Japanese folks loved the live album they put together so much that they decided to release this all over the world as Made in Japan, which, as it turns out, became one of the most iconic live albums of all time, and also just took the stock of Deep Purple and made it soar ever higher. So what do we got on here? Of course, epic versions of Highway Star, Child in Time, Smoke on the Water, The Mule with an amazing drum solo from Ian Pace, Strange Kind of Woman, Lazy, Space Truckin', and then if you get the deluxe edition, you get some encores that were not on the original album in the form of Black Knight, Speed King, and Lucille. So pretty cool. A lot of jam and a lot of extended solos. This is Purple in a live format. At the time, they were just kind of almost like a jam band. They would go on these extended explorations with guitar solos and organ solos, drum solos, and all sorts of interplay between the bands. So, but pretty cool. Like I said, one of the best live albums of all time. But comes the price, right? So here you have this band who, especially this lineup, the Mark II lineup, in just a few short years. So we're looking at like late 1969 up to 1972. Just that's what, maybe 3 years. Tons of touring, nonstop touring in the studio. These guys they're fraying at the edge here. So, and by this time, Blackmore and Gillan just not getting along at all. And you can kind of see the writing on the wall. So they're exhausted. They're at each other's throats. Gillan was having issues with management, all sorts of stuff. I think Glover was as well. But, they rushed him. Management rushed him back into the studio. Got to pump out another album, which they did. January 1973, Who Do We Think We Are? Again, Martin Birch helping out with the engineering and the production. Woman from Tokyo was the single off this album, kind of a minor hit. And the album hit top 20 worldwide, but you could start to see the reviews that came in were not as positive. All right. The sales were not quite up to the standards of the previous couple of albums. And the material, it's a good album, very solid album, but it's not as strong as the ones that came before it. You got Woman from Tokyo, Mary Long, Super Trooper, great tune. Smooth Dancer, Rat Bat Blue, Place in Line, and Our Lady. Good tunes, strong tunes, not great tunes, but a very solid Deep Purple album. But again, the quality, not quite there. Was the album rushed a bit? Perhaps. So, what happens, basically, band goes out, does some touring, but by the end of June 1973, that's basically it. Glover and Gillan decide they've had enough, so I believe the last concert they played together at the time was in Osaka, Japan, and Gillan and Glover are gone, off to do other things. We'll come back to them a little later. So the band decide they're going to reconvene. Right around this time, the surviving members of the band had been checking out another fairly popular band called Trapeze, and they really dug the bass player / lead singer, who is none other than Glenn Hughes. So they decide to have a discussion with Hughes and say, hey, would you be interested in joining Deep Purple? We have an opening. We have a bass slot opening, and we have a vocal slot opening. At the time, they were also talking to Paul Rodgers, as Free had just broken up, and Paul Rodgers was very interested. However, Rodgers also had some other ideas of putting together his own band, which of course would turn out to be the supergroup Bad Company, and they were getting thrown a record contract by Swan Song. So it's like, I think Rodgers was like, well, I'm going to go with Bad Company, even though Purple was a sure thing. So Hughes was coming on board thinking that Rodgers was going to be the lead singer, and he was going to take over bass, maybe do some singing, and that wound up not happening. So basically they kind of discovered this young, unknown, tall singer named David Coverdale, who basically was nobody, but they loved his voice. And I think they wanted someone with that kind of real bluesy, soulful voice, because they had ideas to get Rodgers at the time. So Coverdale was the guy. So basically, late 1973, they go into the studio again with Martin Birch. They put together the Burn album. This is now the Mark III era of the band. Blackmore, Lord, Pace, Coverdale, and Hughes. Coverdale and Hughes would actually share lead vocals. I would say like maybe 60% were done by Coverdale. The other 40 were by Hughes. Kind of a cool combo there. A lot of tunes they would actually sing together throughout. So it's not like, Hughes would just sing like a whole song. Coverdale would sing like a whole song. Coverdale mostly took the leads, but Hughes was there, maybe helping sing in the chorus and some of the verses and things. Really unique way of doing things. And the album is fantastic. So the album is released, like I said, in February 1974. Top 10 most markets across the world. Title track, killer. Might Just Take Your Life, Lay Down, Stay Down, Sail Away, You Fool No One, What's Going On Here, Mistreated, the iconic Mistreated, as well as A200, the instrumental to end the album. A great album. Again, they go out touring all over the place, selling out everywhere they go. Some of the notable shows they played on that tour, they co-headlined along with ELP, the California Jam, out in Oakland, California, and alongside the Eagles and Black Sabbath and Earth, Wind and Fire, Rare Earth, Black Oak, Arkansas, and Seals and Croft. That was in April of 1974. They also played a huge headline show at Madison Square Garden earlier that year, as well as the Nassau Coliseum in Long Island, New York. So a lot of really, really big venues. I believe they were using and I forget the name of the jet that all the big rock bands were using at the time. Starship, is that what it was? It might be. Anyway, I think they had that plane, so they're jetting across. They're living the dream, right? They're superstars at this point. Shortly thereafter, they go back into the studio. November 1974, they release Stormbringer. Okay. A little bit different. Okay. Here you're starting to see more of the Glenn Hughes influence start to take over a lot of the songs. So the tunes are becoming more funky, little bits of R&B and soul kind of peeking through, which didn't really please Mr. Blackmore. He felt the band were moving a little too far away from their heavy rock and blues format into this kind of funky soul thing, which he really didn't like much. And he started to get disenchanted by the band and the music. But they got an album to sell and a tour to do, so they do that. So it's somewhere along the way, a little-known band from the East Coast called Elf happened to be opening up for Deep Purple. And Mr. Blackmore really took a liking to the vocal styles of their singer, Mr. Ronnie James Dio. Okay, so Elf had a couple little minor albums released, and they're on this tour with Purple. So Richie starts to put ideas in his head that he wants to go do another band. Initially, he was talking to like Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy about doing something. That didn't work out, but he starts talking to Ronnie about putting together a project, that he's thinking about leaving Deep Purple. So the seeds start getting planted for Rainbow. And eventually, as they're on tour of Europe for the Stormbringer album, he decides he's had enough. He's going to leave the band. So he tells the band while they're on this tour that he's going to be leaving. So they announce to the world that Richie's going to be leaving the group. This is the final tour with Richie. Surprisingly enough, the shows that they play, those final shows, the European tour, actually damn good. There's a lot of recordings out there. Some of the best performances that Mark III era of the band had performed. And so when Richie finally leaves, I believe the last show is Richie's with Purple was June 21st in Paris, France, 1975. Once he's left the band, of course, what they do, they pump out a quick live album called Made in Europe, meant to kind of commemorate that final tour with Blackmore. Actually a great live album, although severely truncated. They just should have been a double album, but red hot versions of Burn and Mistreated, Lady Double Dealer, You Fool No One, and Stormbringer. A great live album. Really underrated live album. But the funny thing is, an even better version of this would come out years later, which would basically put together those final performances in Paris. I'm going to talk about them a little bit later. So Blackmore's gone. He's off to Rainbow. So the band are like, okay, now what do we do, right? Got to find a replacement. So off they go looking, because they got to put together the Mark IV era or version of the band. Some of the people that they talk to and are considering, we've got Rory Gallagher. That would have been an interesting fit. Probably a little too bluesy for the band, though. Sal Clemenson from the sensational Alex Harvey Band. That might have worked. Mick Ronson, fresh out of David Bowie's band. That might have been interesting. I don't know if that would have worked, though. Clem Clemson from Humble Pie and Coliseum. That might have been a pretty good fit. But none of those guys really had what they were looking for. They were looking for someone who had the attitude and the image and the charisma as well as the musical chops. So they wound up going with a guy from the U.S., an American guitar player named Tommy Bolin, fresh off his stint in the James Gang. Okay, he replaced Joe Walsh in the James Gang. I think that was kind of the deciding factor. Is like he replaced a legend in the James Gang and did really well for himself. So they figured, well, he can replace Blackmore. He also played with Billy Cobham, a band called Zephyr, did some stuff with Moxie. So he had some pedigree. He was a great player. Very different, though. So he joins the band. They go into the studio. They record this very, very good album called Come Taste the Band, which was released in October 1975. Didn't do as well as some of the prior two albums with Coverdale and Hughes, but still, I think a lot of people had a hard time with Blackmore not being in the band. And actually, it's funny because I remember when I first started getting into Purple when I was a teenager, and I had a hard time getting into this album. And it's not till now, many, many years later, that I really have grown to enjoy this album for what it is. It's kind of funky, but it's pretty rockin'. It's definitely not as like funk and R&B centered as the Stormbringer album, but some really, really great material on here. The songwriting of the band, and specifically what Bolin brought to the table. He and Hughes were working quite well together. And it's actually a very, very good album. So it's hit number 43 in the US. Not terrible, not great. Number 19 in the UK. The first album in a while that did not go platinum or gold. Okay, so that shows you popularity waning just a little bit, probably due to the Blackmore factor. Again, also engineered by Martin Birch. So little did the band know that Bolin came into Deep Purple with a massive drug problem. He was a heroin addict, and that started to affect his playing live. So they're out on tour, and he is just, it's kind of hit or miss. For the most part, he's not really cutting it. I think the fans were a little disenchanted because Bolin chose not to play the Blackmore guitar solos note for note, or in some cases even remotely close. He just opted to do his own thing, and because of his drug issues, he was just having a hard time really putting on any resemblance of a good performance on a consistent basis. There were some shows where he was spectacular, but more often than not, he wasn't quite cutting it. And then you had Glenn Hughes, who also had severe drug problems. He had a massive cocaine problem. So between the two of these guys, it was getting really, really hard for the band as a whole to deliver consistently strong performances. So March 15th, 1976, after a gig which was just not good at all. In fact, Hughes was quoted as saying to the audience that, sorry, we're not like up to snuff tonight. We're kind of tired. It's been a long night or something like that, and we'll try and do the best we can for you. After that show, Lord and Pace, who obviously were the two founding members, the only two founding members left, basically walked into each other's dressing rooms and they were like, I don't know why he was saying that. We're busting our asses trying to make the go of this. I think this is the end. And they both looked at each other and they said, yeah, it's time. And then Coverdale walks into the dressing room and says, guys, I think I want to quit the band. This just isn't working. And they looked at him and they said, well, as of right now, there is no band anymore. So three of us are in agreement that that's it. And then they broke the news to the other two guys, and basically Deep Purple was no more. So, but they didn't actually go public with this till July of 1976. So this was a few months later that they kind of kept this all quiet. And as history would turn out, so Tommy Bolin was actually working, finishing up a solo album at the time. He had a couple of really good solo albums, and he went out on a tour, his solo band opening for Jeff Beck. And in late December, or actually early December of that year, 1976, he was found, I think it was after a show, he was found dead in his hotel room at the age of 25 from a heroin overdose, and taken from us way, way too soon. And it's just weird how quickly that happened after the demise of Deep Purple, that they lost Tommy Bolin. So at this point in time, basically Deep Purple's done, right? So here we are. It's not even really the end of the 70s, and this massive band that from 1969 to like 1975, 76 were just so enormous, selling millions of albums, touring all across the world. We're just done. So in their wake, so what happens? So Coverdale goes off, starts up a little solo career, does a solo album, 2 albums, and then decides to put together a band out of the ashes of those solo albums called Whitesnake. And Whitesnake, of course, went on to do very, very well for themselves for a number of years, still to this day. In fact, various members of Purple actually were members of Whitesnake. John Lord and Ian Pace both wound up joining Whitesnake for a bit. Ian Gillan, of course, he's off. He leaves Purple a few years before. He's off doing the Ian Gillan band thing. kind of like a jazz rock group, before putting together the Gillan Band, a true heavy rock band that never got the credit they deserved. We're going to talk about them more on another episode, I think. But the Gillan Band were fantastic. A bunch of very, very strong albums and tours. Blackmore, of course, put together Rainbow. Okay. John Lord and Ian Pace also formed Pace, Ashton, and Lord. Pretty good band. Short-lived, but a pretty good band. Bernie Marsden was also in that band, guitar player. He also went on to Whitesnake not long after. Rod Evans, remember him? Seems like we haven't talked about him in a while. He helped put together the supergroup Captain Beyond, who were fantastic. Nick Simper put together a band called Warhorse, who were so like Deep Purple. It's ridiculous. In fact, if you've never checked out Warhorse, I highly recommend you go check out their 2 albums. They're really, really good. He also was in a band called Fandango, not to be confused with the Fandango that Joe Lynn Turner was also in. Ian Pace also played with Gary Moore. What else? And Ian Gillan, of course, hooked up with Black Sabbath for the Born Again album, right? Kind of a weird combo, but it really worked. And Roger Glover eventually wound up in Rainbow with Ritchie. So all this is going on, you know, from the years 1975, 76, 77, well, throughout the rest of the 70s. So an interesting thing happens in 1980. So a music management company reached out to Rod Evans and said, hey, would you be interested in putting together a new version of Deep Purple and maybe doing some touring, trying to make some money, get some people to come out? So they got a couple ex-players from Steppenwolf and a few other unknown guys, and they put together this bogus version of Deep Purple fronted by Deep Purple's original lead singer, and they went out on a tour as Deep Purple. Well, guys, the original guys in Purple, the rest of them got wind of this, sicked their lawyers on them, and they put a stop to this pretty quickly. They sued them, took them to court, and of course Rod Evans and this bogus Deep Purple conglomerate lost and had to pay a serious amount of money. They got a cease and desist order going, and as it turns out, because of Rod Evans's poor choices here, he basically was no longer allowed to receive royalties from sales of any of the first 3 Deep Purple albums that he appeared on. Not a good choice. Okay, and then Rod Evans, of course, disappeared off the face of the earth. Still to this day, nobody knows what the hell he's doing. So, what happens? So, Ian Gillan, it's in the Gillan Band. He leaves to basically puts Gillan to rest, joins Black Sabbath for a little over a year, and then you start to hear the rumors of the Mark II era reunion of Deep Purple, which actually does happen. So October 1984, actually in April 1984, the band gets together, just figures it all out with the lawyers and everything like that, and they're going to do it. They're going to get back together. They go to a little recording studio in Stowe, Vermont, to record what becomes the Perfect Strangers album, which is released to the world in October of 1984. I remember that day pretty vividly. I was a freshman in college. I was 1 month into school, and this album came out, and to me, that was like the greatest day ever, right? My heroes back together. Perfect Strangers album, pretty good. Pretty solid. I think at the time, everybody loved it. For me, it doesn't hold up as well all these years later. There's some really good tunes on here, but some of it's just kind of safe and kind of generic sounding, but still a very, very solid album. A couple real standout tracks. Of course, you know, Knocking at Your Back Door, the title track, Not Responsible, Nobody's Home, some good tunes. But on the whole, just doesn't hold up that well, but it sold really well. So Perfect Strangers, let's see, made the top 20, both the US and UK, certified platinum in the US, only the second album of theirs to do so after Machine Head. In 1985, they did a huge tour of North America, which I happened to see. It was the second highest grossing tour behind Bruce Springsteen's tour that year. That tells you something, because Bruce was on top of the world at the time. And Roger Glover produced this album. This was a trend we would see throughout the 80s and into the early 90s. So, good stuff, though. They follow that up in January 1987. So they get into the studio late in 86 to record what's known as The House of Blue Light. Again, produced by Glover. This one doesn't do quite as well. Number 30 hits 34 in the US, top 10 in the UK. But the quality is not quite the same. And already you're starting to hear things from behind the scenes that Blackmore and Gillan, again, are not getting along. You knew it was inevitable, right? These two guys just don't like each other. They tried to make it work. I think once the honeymoon was over after the initial release of Perfect Strangers and that first tour, I think all the bad blood started creeping back in again, which is a real shame. But a decent album. Some good tunes on here. This one holds up actually pretty well. But again, it's not like absolutely perfect Deep Purple, but it's pretty damn solid. I actually like this album. They follow that up with a live album called Nobody's Perfect, okay, which was released in 1988. Decent live album. My problem with it is that it's so much that's on here are like, you know, new versions of tunes we heard on the Made in Japan album. So that was kind of disappointing. You know, other than like a new version of Hush with Gillan singing, you know, Highway Star, Strange Kind of Woman, Hard, Knocking at Your Back Door, which is pretty cool. Got a couple of the tunes from Perfect Strangers, Lazy, Black Knight, Woman from Tokyo, Smoke on the Water. It's okay. It's a solid album. So what do we got here? So by this time, again, the issues between Blackmore and Gillan are just coming to a head. And the management company says, we got to get rid of Gillan at this point, because if we want this band to carry on, something's got to give. And Blackmore at this time has a lot of power in the band. A lot of power. I guess he always did, but more so, it seemed, in the 80s. So in 1989, Gillan is fired, and they start talking to a bunch of different singers as replacement. Came very close to hiring Jimmy Jamison from Survivor, but there was legalities prevented it from happening. That might have been an interesting choice. Brian Howe, who was with Bad Company, was also considered. Doug Pinnick from Kins X was considered. That would have been kind of strange. Terry Brox, Jimmy Barnes, all were talked to, but ultimately Blackmore made the push to get his former singer in Rainbow hired, of course, Joe Lynn Turner. And the resulting album was Slaves and Masters. This became Mark V, Deep Purple, Blackmore, Pace, Lord, Glover, Turner. This album was released in October of 1980. Probably their worst-selling album since their first couple. It only made it to number 87 in the U.S. Did much better in the UK, hit number 45. Roger Glover produced it again. I'll go on record as saying this is probably easily my least favorite Deep Purple album. I just find it really bland and uninspiring. Couple okay tunes. I saw them live on this tour. It was basically like seeing that final version of Rainbow, or the Joe Lynn Turner version of Rainbow, like the bent out of shape years, but with a couple Deep Purple members in it. It just doesn't. I just never reached for this. I have no reason. It's not like it's awful. It's just kind of bland. It's kind of like Purple doing Foreigner, or just Purple just an extension of those last couple Rainbow albums, which again, they're not terrible. I like Bent Out of Shape. I love Straight Between the Eyes, but that's separate, right? You don't want Deep Purple sounding like that. So kind of short-lived, right? So they tour in 1991. They were getting ready to, and the tour did fairly well. I saw them on the tour, like I said, I think at Radio City Music Hall. They go back into the studio in 1992, but the management has other ideas, because of course 1992, it's now the basically 25th anniversary of the band. They want to do a big splash. Something big's got to happen. Of course, they want Gillan back in the band. So they start talking to Richie and the band, and Richie's, hesitant. He doesn't want Gillan back, obviously, but the management has their way, and they fire Joe Lynn Turner. Gillan's brought back in the middle of recording the album. So Turner had already worked on some of the arrangements and sang some of the stuff, and Gillan basically has to go in. And again, those songs were written with Joe Lynn Turner in mind, so Gillan's got to go in and add his stamp. He's a totally different type of singer. Blackmore, of course, wasn't happy with that. Blackmore felt that Gillan had added a lot of unmusicalness, or whatever that he had proclaimed, that his singing style just was very unmelodic and did not fit those songs. In actuality, Battle Rages On is pretty damn good. There's some really good tunes on here, I think. The title track is great. Anya is great. Lick It Up is good. Talk About Love is a great, great tune. Ramshackle Man, One Man's Meat, some nasty piece of work. Some good stuff on here. But the album didn't do too well. So it hit number 87 in the U.S., released in October. Battle Rages On, July 1993. barely made the top 200 in the U.S. I think it hit 194. So their stock is dropping, right? Still able to draw a crowd, but as far as like their days of selling lots of albums, that's pretty much over. So Glover co-produced it. It was actually recorded in Bearsville Studios in New York. So in the middle of the tour, in fact, the date was November 17th in Helsinki, Finland. Blackmore up and quits right in the middle of the tour, leaves the band high and dry. And that, for the rest of the band, was the straw that broke the camel's back. There's no repairing this relationship, so that would be the last time that he would step on stage or play with his mates in Deep Purple. So what do? They got to find someone. And who answers the call but Joe Satriani, who basically helps formulate the Mark VI era of the band. So Satch joins just temporarily. He finishes up a lot of the touring commitments with the band. It actually fits in very, very well. But he still has a very lucrative solo career with Epic Records, and he really didn't want to walk away from that. So while they offered him the full-time gig in the band, he opted not to go back to his career, so they had to find someone else. And who did they find? A kind of an unlucky replacement, but one who has stood the test of time and really fit in quite well. Steve Morse of the Dixie Dregs, Steve Morse Band, also formerly of Kansas. So Steve officially joins the band in late 1995, making the Mark VII lineup of the band. Lord, Pace, Gillan, Glover, Morse, and they go into the studio and record Perpendicular, released in 1996. A stellar first album with Steve Morse. A really strong Deep Purple album with a lot of great tunes. Ted the Mechanic, Sometimes I Feel Like Screaming, Cascades, I'm Not Your Lover, The Aviator, and Morse, just his virtuoso skills have been acknowledged for years and years and years by critics and fans alike. And I think a lot of people thought it might be a kind of a weird fit, and maybe for some people still feel that to this day, but he's still in the band. Over 20 years in the band. And this is just a really, really great album. Really great album that forced a lot of people to say, hey, this band still has a lot left to give, right? So, do a lot of touring, right? Go back into the studio. 1998's Abandon. Another very strong album. Pretty rockin' album. This is, I think, is the heaviest album of the Morse era, I should say. Any Fool Know That, Almost Human, Seventh Heaven, Watching the Sky, Fingers to the Bone, Jack Ruby. A lot of really great, heavy tunes on here. By this point in time, Gillan's voice obviously knocked down a few notches. Most people who got to see Purple live around that time, or even noticed on the studio albums, that a lot of the high-pitched screams and wails that Gillan used to do, pretty much non-existent this time. His voice had really taken on, I guess, the ravages of time, all the screaming, the cigarettes and the alcohol and whatnot, just really kind of, I wouldn't say killed his voice, but made him change his vocal style. So he now, right around this time, he's going for more of like an elder statesman style of vocal, which still is fine. He still is a good singer, especially on album. It's when he goes to try and sing some of those old Purple classics that you realize how much he's lost vocally, but he's still Gillan. Still awesome. So they would continue to tour. So by this time, Purple is just like a regular touring machine all over the world, constantly out on the road. And, John Lord, who is approaching 70 at the time, says to the guys, hey, you know what? I think it's time for me to pack it in. So in 2002, John Lord retires from the band. His replacement, none other than Don Airey. They go into the studios for Bananas, 2003. First one with Don Airey. Of course, we know Don Airey from Ozzy and Rainbow, Coliseum 2, Gary Moore, and he's played with basically everybody. And he fits right in he fits in really well. In fact, if you've seen, there's a video from a concert where he and Lord get to play together for a few tunes. It's actually really, really cool. It's kind of like a passing of the torch, so to speak. But Banana's a pretty strong album. Don't like it as much as the two that came before it, but pretty strong. They come back a couple years later, 2005, with Rapture of the Deep. Another very solid album. Money Talks, Wrong Man, Girls Like That. Clearly quite absurd. Junkyard Blues, Before Time Began, MTV. Solid album. Not great, but pretty damn solid. Then the next thing that happens, Fast forward to 2012, Purple loses their first former member. John Lord passes away at age 71 after a short battle with cancer. Sad day. A legend. Sad, sad day in the band. But they continue on. Okay. They put out this album a year later, which for me is probably the strongest album they've released since the 80s. I think it even tops Perpendicular. The Now What album, their first with producer Bob Ezrin, a really, really, really strong album. A lot of great tunes. A Simple Song, Out of Hand, Hell to Pay, Bodyline, Above and Beyond, Blood from a Stone, Uncommon Man, All the Time in the World, Vincent Price. A lot of really, really great tunes on here. And it basically got great reviews. Fans loved it. Critics loved it. The band continues to go out on the road. And there's renewed interest in the band. And I think their partnership with Ezrin really worked, and they wanted to do again, which they did. So in 2017, they went back into the studio, put together Infinite, Time for Bedlam, Hit Boots, All I Got Is You, One Night in Vegas, Get Me Out of Here, The Surprising, Johnny's Band, On Top of the World, Bird of Prey. Only bad song on here, I think, is their rendition of Roadhouse Blues, which is kind of lazy and, I don't know, just not into that. I would have rather heard another original tune, but still a very, very strong album. Maybe not quite as strong as this one here, but I think damn good. And I think these two, as well as Perpendicular, make up the three strongest albums of the Morse era. So the band are on tour once again. They're saying they're on the I forget what they call it, the longest tour, which might be their last tour. I mean, these guys are all getting up there, so we might, after this tour is over and they're going out with Judas Priest later in the summer, might be their last tour. Who knows? Hopefully they decide to record more albums. We shall see. But I did not want to end the show without talking about some really cool live albums. All right? Purple's got a ton of live albums that they released, either officially or non-officially or whatnot. And I got a boatload of them. I just want to give some quick mentions to these. So, and a lot of these are excellent, by the way. So there's the Copenhagen 1972. Quite strong. What do we got here? Live with the Orchestra at the Montreux Jazz Festival 2011. Something more recent. Quite good. Total Abandon Australia 1999. Also very solid. More Live at Montreux 2006. Obviously, you see they like to return to Montreux, right? Here's more. 1996. Fresh off of Perpendicular, right? So this is the Morse era, the Morse lineup. First time at Montreux. Here we got in concert with the London Symphony Orchestra. This is pretty solid too. Here's one from 1976, February 27, 1976 at Long Beach Arena. So this is the Tommy Bolin version of the band. This is actually one of the stronger shows that Tommy appeared on with the band. So I guess this particular night, he kind of had his shit together. Here also, the Bolin era, live in Tokyo this time around. Not quite the case here. This one is notable for some really just poor performances from Bolin, but the rest of the band actually sounds really good. I got here, this is called Deep Purple Singles and EP Anthology 68 to 80. This is a collection of some cool B-sides and singles and alternate versions of stuff. Definitely worth having. All right, I mentioned this one on the show. Actually, I'm going to pull both of these up together. So this is Gras 1975. Again, that last tour with Blackmore. Fantastic. It's amazing how good the performances were with Richie when they band and everybody knew he was leaving. They really, really nailed those shows. This is, I just love this one to death. This is basically made in Europe on steroids, almost like complete. This is the full Live in Paris 1975 performance. Fantastic. If you listen to this, you'll hear lots of the recordings that they basically took the Made in Europe album. They spliced and diced some recordings from this show and a couple other shows right around the same time. So you'll hear a lot of things like, "Whoa, that's from the Made in Europe one, right?" But this is the original performance from that night. Fantastic. Burn, Stormbringer, a terrific Gypsy, a terrific Mistreated, Lady Double Dealer, Smoke on the Water, You Fool No One, a great You Fool No One, Space Truckin' Going Down, and Highway Star. fantastic. Coverdale and Hughes are awesome. Blackmore is probably some of the best guitar playing I've ever heard from him is on these recordings. Wonderful stuff. Here we got Live in California, California Jam 1974. This is killer too. So right, you know, the Mark III era of the band is pretty fresh and young, just killing it in front of hundreds of thousands of people. This is actually pretty early on with the Mark III era of the band. This is live in London at the in Kilburn, Gaumont State Theatre. Also very, very strong. Again, a lot of the set lists are kind of the same on a lot of these, but the great thing is Purple, one of those bands at that time who never played the same song the same way twice in a row. This is a good one. Live in Concert, 1970 to 72. Like this one a lot. If you like the Made in Japan album, you'll dig this. A lot of really long extended versions of tunes, but you got some stuff on these here that were not played in Japan, which is pretty neat. Long Beach, 1971. This is quite good as well. Lengthy versions of Speed King, Strange Kind of Woman, Child in Time, and Mandrake Root. 1970 in Stockholm, also very, very good. Really, really good stuff. Montreux, 1969. Excellent stuff. Early recordings with Gillan. And then, of course, this one, live at Inglewood, 1968. This is with Evans and Simper. Kind of rough sounding, but still worth having because you've got, there's not much, if any, live recordings from the Mark I version of the band. So, before I end, probably thinking, what are my top 3 favorite Purple albums of all time? So, I'm going to tell you. In Rock, number 1. Fireball, number 2. Burn, number 3. If we're going to go top 5. 4 is Machine Head. And I'm going to skip the live albums and give you another studio album. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, Now What? What? No Perfect Strangers? I'm a big fan of Now What. It's a really, really good album. So there you have it. Visit us on the web at www.seaoftranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Of course, we're here fairly often on the mighty YouTube. Got a new product show coming up for you next. Lots of new releases I want to talk to you about that's coming up this week. Till then, go out and listen to some Purple. Greatest band ever in history. Along with Black Sabbath, my 2 favorite bands of all time. I just love them both to death. But Purple for me is number 1. Have been for a long time, and I'm happy to bring this show to you. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Take care.